Hello everyone, today I would like to talk about mercenaries and more specifically about the degree of mortality that these troops underwent into a fight. And it won't be a video based on actual a list of statistics and numbers and stuff because telling the truth, historiography is already enough developed in that sense. I would like to address the topic from excuse me from a kind of a conceptual point of view. I mean, the reasons why we have certain myths and prejudices or stereotypes about mercenaries around history. We will be talking especially about late medieval and early modern Europe in here, but these are considerations that want to be a bit general towards the figure of the mercenaries as themselves, and try to dispel those myths that surround these figures, especially relatively to their indeed the idea that the mercenaries just think about saving their own skins, which as we will be seeing, it's something that every soldier does, and it's absolutely frequent in history to see mercenaries that actually can stand till the very last, into a battlefield. So there is no actual structural reason to think like that. Mercenaries being true professionals of war, and we will be talking also about their kind of the motivations that a mercenary can have, aside from just money for fighting, and what's the comparison with a normal soldier or with a normal levy or someone who, however, is brought on the battlefield for any possible reason. So as you understand, it's a very generalistic concept. These are most my reflections that I had and that I have after several years spent thinking about them, just in Outlook, but really trying to answer the whole problem, and having read extensively about campaigns, battles, and really forming a personal opinion of mine on on the topic. And I would like to hear, of course, your opinion on the subject matter, whether you agree or disagree with me, and all. Now I just will drink because as you hear, I'm keeping to cough. Just wait a second. I don't understand why every time I eat hamburgers after dinner I have to cough, and that's very annoying, especially when I'm recording. So first of all, I would like to start with kind of the most emblematic figures of mercenaries into history, that are the Condottieri of the 15th century. I say historiographically speaking because indeed I cannot find a valid reason for which the Condottieri should be seen as the prototype of mercenaries. The story of these professionals of war and kind of organizers of war. I mean, not being just merely military executioners, but being also involved into political affairs, but really also being busy into the actual business of war, providing food and pay, and organizing their own troops as companies. Obviously, also this has a story because the Condottieri are this Italian term that entered into historiography because at a certain point into Italian history, in the 15th century especially, but even previously and afterwards, and the Condottieri were, as mercenary troops, basically the only professional troops existing into in practice, at least, into Italian warfare, Italian meant especially as the center and the north, because the south had a kingdom of its own with the feudal aristocracy being of used as in other kingdoms like in France or in England. But you see that even there, with the system of the Indian tours in England, for instance, that this business of war was actually performed in quite very similar organizational fashion in majority of Europe. Mercenaries having always existed in Europe, and having always existed because you can find all the time anyone who can fight for you for money. And in this sense, I would like to reflect on the very core of the difference between a mercenary and a soldier. I mean, people say, well, yes, basically they get both paid, so they all have this monetary reason for doing so, but a soldier is so more attached to his homeland, and he wants to protect his own, his community, his family, and all, that he's gonna be probably more reliable. This is a very optimistic statement. First of all, if you look at history, there would be communities out there that in certain cases would have preferred every every sovereign to change without having to serve into battle. We're talking, especially in this Ancien Regime society, of families, people that really had a very meager amount of resources. They, of course, they spiced war in this sense relative to whoever waged it. So either they were invaders or on their own state. And what they would do in war would be mostly saving their own skins, taking refuge somewhere, maybe up in the mountains, in the forests, and just letting the armies ravaging their own meager properties that could be literally built up once again, even though dying of starvation was quite out there as an option. And the people who were instead more interested into this kind of territorial defense and attachments were the states. I mean, these political entities were creating a centralized dominion over a certain territory that had certain structures, that controlled local communities, that had affirmed in the first place as an oppressor of the people who were in fact subjects to them. So even if you look into the perspective eventually with the creation of the modern state, with the France of Louis XIV, or eventually the Napoleon, the revolutionary nation state formed with the French Revolution, and this kind of omnipresent state that gets rid of the ancien regime juridical particularism of the local communities. You see that Wu stressed mostly the idea of nation, of state, of the citizens who were willing to die for their own homeland, was the same state, and that until especially the mass society, there would be obviously a large parts of the population were willing to die into battle for their own state, but if there hadn't been no state, probably these populations would have reacted in quite of a different way, and we know that many people simply didn't want to fight. I mean, there were, of course, certain states, especially the most advanced one for quality of life and all, that had especially a middle class that because this is kind of a middle class cliche. The idea of being, of feeling and having interests, especially in having part into a political community from which the middle classes, in this sense, and not surprisingly, exactly at the rise of the of the nation state wanted to were so much in love with this idea, but they they weren't up to a century before into which they didn't want to pay their money for paying for financing the campaigns of the absolute monarchs. So it's all a matter of interest and of the relation between politics and war, and who controls war through politics. So and this is always a matter of interest, and we can say that largely the most the lower strata of the population could naturally show some form of patriotism, especially once that they were recruited and began to feel part of an army, have growing an esprit de corps, and feeling maybe more attached to their own unit than maybe to the same state. This is something you find easily even today, people who fought in even recent wars and all, that they are kind of proud of their own, their own regiment, their own comrades and all, their own company. Usually it's the company, the organics level that feels most the esprit de corps, but they maybe do not tend as veterans to glorify their own state for what it's done on in terms of war and all. And as a matter of fact, especially lower classes suffering of this idea that of plots like there is an old kind of guy that has his own political interests and sends the youngers to die for his own banks and all, but telling the truth, the history is a bit more complex than this, and really these conceptions tend even to draw increasingly away people from the understanding of war as it is, and the very delicate relation that exists between the citizens' responsibility and the politics of a state, especially in our Western world, into which we have at least a substantial form of democracy. So all this story for saying that when it comes to the reasons why we want to fight, it's pretty much evident that when the risk is too high and things are getting rough, you don't have to eat, and you're wary of war, you're tired and all, you're gonna surrender, whether you're a mercenary or an overzealous patriot, because war is not something that you can do with such feelings. People still fall into the mass delusion that wars are won by those who are more courageous and more brave. Wars are not won at all with anything of that, because humans have a pretty much average standard of individual courage and as much as cowardice. They all react as functioning bodies in the same ways, and war is really something that is won or lost at the top for major political or military reasons that they decide at the top, and that most of the times have really nothing to do with the performance of, or the beliefs of the individual soldier. And it's no surprise in this sense that the despise towards mercenaries and these great forms of chauvinism are shared by people who eventually stress mostly towards their national interest, and while brought on the battlefield they would probably flee and whine and get traumatized like anyone else, in spite of all their overconfidence about the performances of their own connationals. So if you look at history, at least this is I was saying, I'm just telling you from my own experience of studying military history in many ages. of history, is that mercenaries most of the times are some of the most reliable forces you can have, and the actual distrust that derives from their, especially their loyalty, because this is what the main prejudice of the idea that the mercenary is not a loyal one. Well, masses aren't either, and mercenaries are unloyal when they can obtain something greater, and this is not much of a military aspect, because obviously mercenaries can act from the top of their military prowess and their military experience, that sometimes it's the greatest available around. But it's more of a political thing, because even if you look at the age of the Condottieri, these Condottieri were first of all very big figures, in the sense that they organized as we were saying, the administration of sometimes even thousands of armored troops that were the best available guys around for fighting. And if they found a weak political regime that was the one who employed them sometimes, the same one that had employed them sometimes, they could, through that military prowess, kind of seizing power and exploiting the situation. But that's something that, if you look at the local communities, they were trying to do continuously. Like in the same cities, in the same states, there was always someone who wanted to get at the top. Doesn't matter whether it's a republic or an absolute monarchy. We are talking about an age in history in which the political stability of certain regimes was pretty low. So if mercenaries could reach the top, that's not really a matter because they were unloyal compared to others. Plots, assassinations, coup d'etat, and all that being something extremely common at the time from all the strata of the population who could afford to do that. And if anything, it only proves that the mercenaries at that point had a great weight as professionals of war. That's it. And historiography has really worked on this a lot. I mean, if you take even in the same Renaissance age, the time in which the Condottieri were fighting during the wars of Italy and all, if you take an author like Machiavelli, who was a Florentine ambassador and an administrator of the city of the Republic of Florence, he had, and as I hope every one of you knows, one of the pillars of Western political thought, was quite harsh towards mercenaries, because he had a kind of fanatic ideal of a state that was inspired by the Romans, and not by the real Roman history, but how the Romans had kind of idealized their own past with their own virtues and all, and that stressed remarkably the importance of having what Machiavelli calls your own arms, implying an army made up of people who inhabited in your own territory and that were paid by the state, and also normal, we can't say the professionals of war, because in the Florentine ideal, it was something quite different from the local military tradition, but still someone who could take arms every once in a while when it was needed, and to be faithful essentially to the sovereign. Now, the interesting aspect of this is that Machiavelli didn't have in mind exactly an army of citizens. He had in mind an army of peasants. That is essentially the lower strata of the population that inhabited the Florentine countryside, and that were a step below, of the of the Florentine citizens were being usually rich merchants who didn't care about spending their own money into into their own equipment, into war in the first place, could from the top of their financial wealth to just keep these peasants in a not very demanding fashion. The Florentines would actually try this into the wars of Italy, and it would turn out a disaster by the way. So not exactly a very good recipe. So a completely different ideal from even the one of the citizen soldier that was fully reproposed in actual and practicable historical terms in the 19th century. And Machiavelli is obviously famous for his loath towards mercenaries, because he said they are unruly, they're not loyal, they cost a lot, and they follow you as long as the situation is favorable to you. Then they pass to to the adversary when if he pays them more, and also. And you can't really be so harsh on judging Machiavelli, because indeed in the Italian politics of the time a great problem was also caused by this, but the problem was much because of the mercenaries, as we were saying, but of the political situation of Italy. A lot of an extremely wealthy we can't say mercantile states, even if they weren't properly all mercantile, but the idea is it was more of the mindset, the idea of minimizing the costs of war and really avoiding to spend too much, and therefore hiring these mercenaries just for a certain time and hoping they would do well. Now the problem is that these mercenaries at that point instead would push for remaining on the field more, because in this way they could be paid more and receive more money. Now certain states in Italy suffered more or less of this thing, Florence probably being quite the worst example, because they, with their own republicanism, they were much more distrustful of armed men of every kind, and therefore they lagged far behind other Italian powers. But being, if you take Venice, for instance, or Milan, even if with substantial difference in their organization, we can say, especially in Venice, that the Condottieri were very well framed into the political and military system. Venice was very able of controlling the Condottieri, and even essentially absorbing them in part as a sort of professional standing army controlled directly by the state, not by the Condottieri themselves. There are the so-called broken lances, lance spezzate in 15th century Italian, who were these guys who basically had remained without employment, or maybe their condottieri had died, and therefore the Venetian state absorbing them and maybe even giving them land or settling them in some place and using them. The Venetian system, in this sense, being also the base of more centralized, as an inspiration to more centralized armies like the ones, for instance, of Charles of Burgundy, that was creating something very interesting in his own armed forces with the Bandet d'Ordonnance in his own duchy. So just for saying that it really depends on who are you listening to. Probably most Italian powers didn't share the same Machiavelli's view on how war had to be waged. Some certain Italian lords, being condottieri themselves, and not just in origin, but really fighting and all around. And it is true that mercenaries switched side according to who paid them best. But this was obvious because the political situation was changing constantly. And even if you look at more unitary entities that eventually entered into the Italian theater during the Italian wars, even there think about the Bourbon in France that eventually switched to the Spanish, Or, I mean, there are a lot of examples of how, generally speaking, this it was really the whole system who was calling for people to switch side, and not really the nature of mercenaries or people who were paid for money in this sense. And as long as you had a pay and you fought for the side that gave you more certainties, a safer existence, why change inside? There would be also a lot of deserters into the national armies of Spain or France at this time. I mean, as always, it is the case. So why looking really at mercenaries as an unloyal force? And by the way, what we forget, especially when we talk about the age of the Condottieri, is that actually the whole military systems in Europe at this time worked through mercenaries, in the sense that war was not, and this would remain ordinary administration, let's say normal business, until the creation of true states like the French one in the second half of the 17th century. Simply the local sovereign hired these bands, these companies that existed since the Middle Ages at this point, in their organizing form, having especially fastened and developed during the 14th century, but really existing before, even in the full age of feudalism, into which cavalry was, because normally there were cavalrymen, even if during the Renaissance period other specializations kind of were necessary at one point, and they had always been there, at least for hiding the cavalrymen. So all the system that you see in this ancien regime was based on the hiring of mercenaries. The fact that the Italian condottieri remained famous because they were such great men, to which the states built up statues, and they glorified, and they kind of they were made also in Renaissance Italy, by these great, really immortalized by these great pieces of art and all. It's something that obviously remained into Western society as a memory of a world that was fascinating even beyond the same condottieri. And there is a lot of drama even in fictionalization, even in that age of Italian history. I mean, I know people were literally obsessed with the Borgia and other, and I think it's most of a literary thing than an actual historical interest, because there are so many things that happened before and afterwards, even relatively to these matters of intrigues and warfare and all, that I don't see it really justified, if not because the whole thing has become a sort of a myth in Western culture for many for other reasons that have very few to do with factual history of those times. But I would like to discuss also another point. I mean, the idea of how much would really these mercenaries be exposed on the battlefield. Because going back on Machiavelli, Machiavelli wrote, usually you remember The Prince and maybe other minor works, even a comedy he wrote, but Machiavelli wrote a huge amount of treatises, of considerations, of stories. He was also a historian, and he wasn't a very good one in the sense that he indeed knew a lot, but he was the kind of guy who could force the whole reality just to adapt to his own beliefs. And we have to understand it as a man of the Renaissance. It was normal in many ways. Machiavelli being actually important for having stressed what eventually was taken once again by Montecuccoli, by von Clausewitz and other major political thinkers of the West, that there is a strict connection between politics and war, and really adding a bit of realism, and even of crudity, of cynical look at political and military matters, without trying to idealize them like it could happen in a chivalric or a chivalric or in a Christian fashion, like it had happened into certain specula principum into the Middle Ages, when thinking about the ideal sovereign and how he had to use war and all. So we thank Machiavelli for everything he wrote. But he also made a lot of mistakes, and the worst about this is that there were eventually a lot of people in historiography following his ideas, and one of these ideas concerned the degree of mortality of the Condottieri age into battles that were fought into 15th century Italy, and about which Machiavelli wrote. And there are very famous passages in which he says, there were these battles here into which thousands of people of Condottieri were engaged, and at the end of the day there were like 10 dead people or something like that. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but Machiavelli is not really far from this. Now, today we know by analyzing those the stories of those singular battles that what Machiavelli wrote has no historical evidence to be backed by, in the sense that those battles seem to have had a mortality rate that was completely in the average into Western warfare at the time. But the idea, this prejudice stemmed from the idea that the Condottieri were kind of playing the war, while their political masters had sent them to annihilate the enemy, and they wouldn't do that because they preferred to essentially to mind their own accounts, their own money, in the way they organized the troops, and they simply didn't want to die, and they didn't want to lose too many men in that way. So that even among Condottieri that were fighting one against the other, there would be certain tacit agreements for not shedding blood and all. Well, this simply is not true. First of all, if we compare the mortality rates of the Italian Condottieri to any other kind of similar troops that existed there in France, in England, in Germany, and etc., we see that the mortality, especially among heavily armored knights, was pretty low, generally speaking, in the Old Middle Ages, for very obvious reasons, which was the fact that armors, especially between the before the final development of firearms into the threshold of the modern age, were absolutely not capable of. There was no no weapon that could basically pierce those armors, if not like at extremely close range, or at a point that would be even difficult to access on the battlefield. If you look about the major battles of the feudal age, famously, because sometimes they're better described in 12th century France or England, you notice that the mortality rate indeed was very low. And there were kind of ideals that stressed this fact that knights didn't have to kill each other, because they were kind of gentlemen, and they had to ideally surrender to the ones that had defeated them and then being taken prisoner. But the truth being that these guys didn't die simply because they could be ransomed with very high costs. So it would be stupid to kill them. But secondarily, we don't know about the commoners. We don't know, neither in most, at least compared to the knights, nor in the feudal age, nor in the Condottieri age, or at least we know much less about the fate of the non-knights. I mean, all those, especially infantrymen, that would follow the knight armies, and that during the Condottieri age were was substantially increasing, because Condottieri warfare was mostly a mounted warfare. But indeed, especially with the development of infantry formations and of artillery and firearms, etc., there were increasing numbers of soldiers who were of lower, a lower status, singularly speaking, even in terms of military effectiveness, that however that they were quite useful from a tactical point of view, and especially that carried out the majority of the military operations, because the heavily armored condottiere that had, all the guys aiding him, mounting these plate armors and then getting them on horses and all, were very depending. We're kind of obviously of an elite troop, of an elite units that entered into battle only when there was a major involvement, and we know that these major involvements, like pitched battles, being quite rare at the time, not just in Italy, that by the way had its own reasons for fighting in that fashion, not because the condottieri didn't want to fight. But there would be a lot of other troops about we don't know much, like scouters and people who made recognition, that they helped in the logistical system. They dug trenches, field fortifications and all. But sometimes would do that under fire with enemies attacking, and that kind of prepared eventually in the path for the elite heavy cavalry to eventually fight if the situation was favorable. And these people would die, of course, because there were usually less less protected than knights. Firearms were spreading at a fast pace, but generally speaking, they were the ones who were mostly at contact with the enemy and for a longer time. And with lesser defenses and with less precautions also, because they costed less. This is sad, but this is how it happened. If you cost a lot to keep, to train and all, you're not likely to be spent in that way. And this happened literally in every other place of the world at this point, not really just among the condottieri. And I'm personally studying certain part of the 14th century in warfare, into which the condottieri system was spreading. Mercenaries having always been there and just increasing in numbers compared to the others, up to the point of becoming dangerous even from a political point of view. But as I was saying, that was more the fault of those who employed the guys and who had allowed them to become so pervasive, and essentially relying only on these forces at this point, and not anymore on the citizen ones that were at least framed into a local political system that for which, yes, they could be more faithful in general, but being also less effective as troops indeed, so not really a fault at all. And I'm relatively to the progressive, the progressive transformation of warfare from something more dynamic into something more of a sort of a war of position, with armies really facing themselves for a long time. You see that there were actual strategical reasons for doing that actually prove instead the increase of the military capabilities of the various political entities. I mean, the wars between amateurs of like citizen militia that fought against each other being always more clumsy and even more kind of reckless and more unaware, simply being incapable even of providing of their own defense in certain times. So the professionals of war really instead who had always been there, had always been proving how to really fight and how to take all the precautions and how to be prudent and not to commit into bold and senselessly direct actions that could bring to disasters. There are certain episodes, even in the Condottieri history, in this sense, into which you had a political body of citizens who had hired these Condottieri, and this political body being made up of rich merchants, essentially unaware of how war was actually waged from a military point of view. Even though they knew how to finance war and how to understand war in other ways, that however ordered without any military competence this Condottieri to, I don't know, engage an enemy, and the Condottieri is saying, look, this is risky, or maybe this is wrong because this is not the right time, or this is gonna be a mistake from a strategical point of view, and sometimes these men being obliged by this at this point these silly politicians to carry out that military operation and clamorously failing, and sometimes the Condottieri simply said, okay, then I'm gonna be paid anyway, because these they would increasingly be, by the way, always I can't say more distant from the battlefield, because the Condottieri were always there, but being really more like commanders-in-chief, and although the likelihood of dying was still present, they were usually treated with respect, and they wouldn't be killed, or they would have at least the means to have their own command on the field and managing to escape or something like that. So at that point there wouldn't even be a personal commitment into the fight up to a certain point. This is valid especially for those big armies that were fielded with thousands of men. Obviously there were also smaller companies of even a few tens of troops that would be employed and employed singularly, maybe, I don't know, attached or joining with other companies, but in this sense being more sort of tactical small tactical units, and being more directly involved into warfare, even as relatively to their individual commanders. So as you understand, it's very complicated. The Condottieri, however, being always extremely skilled professionals of wars and knowing perfectly, as far as we can see, how to shed blood, how to destroy, how to make a mess, and their expertise in doing this tells you that they knew how to do it simply because they had been doing that at some time in their lives, especially if they had risen from the ranks. And secondly, that in a way or another, this being such a standard capability that you can't really identify a structural weakness of the Condottieri system as if they were not capable of war. I mean, I've heard people to say, Italy was eventually conquered by these the foreigners like Spain and France and all, because the Condottieri were kind of inepts who didn't know how to make war. Well, this is completely false. The Condottieri proved to be excellent military men. If anything, was the political crisis of Italy that brought from its division and lack of wide political let's say of certain political culture that eventually brought Italy to be conquered. But the Condottieri were some really of the best troops that were available, and the Italian Condottieri, when Italy was conquered, would be integrated into the armies of France, of Spain, especially because eventually the wars were won by Spain, and and making their own war job pretty well for centuries to come, telling the truth. So these prejudices are kind of silly, and as they are silly in general, all those ideas that want the condottieri as people who didn't risk personally their lives, uh, or that warfare was kind of a or the condottieri warfare was an easy business, as if nobody would get killed. And no, numbers show us that this wasn't the case, and the actual evidence being on the contrary, that certain condottieri battles were absolutely even bloodier than the average sometimes, and the rest being average in practice. So we don't really have any we don't have to stress that. Then the idea also that these clashes were not bloody, being false, has still to understand what the political, what the horizons of these condottieri were. It's obvious that if you have a company that you use essentially as a trade, as a real business, it's obvious that you're not gonna be extremely eager to risk it, as if it didn't matter. Especially when there is not a unitary command. This is an interesting point, because even a state can field a huge army and having invested a lot in it, and in this sense not wanting to waste it, but at least at that point there is a unitary command. If you have a lot of companies that are meant to fight together as one, and each company wants to has a certain degree of autonomy for which it can avoid a confrontation if it thinks that maybe another company can do it in its place, then there maybe you can get the problem. And as you see also here, it's not a military problem, because those individual companies are perfectly able to perform the task, but it's just the lack of a unified command that brings to uncoordination, makes things fail, maybe without even getting to the actual engagement, maybe just retreating and all. But we know in this sense that when there was a clear aim, there was a clear interest, the condottieri could simply do his own job very effectively, very cleanly, and very bloodily, definitely. So as I was saying before, battlefields were also increasing in their own in danger, because firearms, especially artillery, getting always more lethal against heavily armored troops. So even when you talk about, I mean, the condottieri were an age that in a certain sense conclude the medieval era as a, ideally speaking, because eventually the Renaissance kicks in, and sometimes the condottieri are considered in this sense to be on the sunset when the wars of Italy broke out. But telling the truth, professionals of war who organized their companies of mercenaries are something that kept existing and probably even developing far in time across that. So there is really no limit in this sense. If you take the French term, the venturier, or the Italian venturieri in this sense, are all troops that during the 16th and 17th century were still out there, of guys that went into these battlefields, and even as cavalry still, because you know that during especially around the mid of the 16th century, there is the maximum contraction of cavalry use on the battlefield compared to relatively to the advancement of the infantries, the tactical progress of infantries. And then eventually cavalry starts regaining ground in this evolution. So there is really no discontinuity here. The fact that that the condottieri as such were kind of disappearing as in the relation that had existed to that specific part of Europe in Italy, with the relative political entities that employed them didn't mean that they disappeared. If anything, it was those political political entities that disappeared, and the professionals of war remaining always on the market and adapting to a very much ferocious, a much more ferocious Renaissance warfare that at that point was definitely increasing the mortality of troops, but not because of a sort of a tendency of saving lives or not being mindful of the costs of war, but simply because from a physical point of view, because technology had evolved at a point that you could have an arquebus projectile that was tens of times more charged in energy than a crossbow bolt, and could kill with much more ease, and that would suffice alone to increase mortality. And the Renaissance battlefields also seeing the rise of increasingly greater armies because of the development of the states that could field them, and therefore more people being engaged into the battlefield, and more bloodshed ensuing in absolute terms, and also in relative terms, in terms of losses to the actual. So very different from a bunch of very heavily armored guys that can charge against each other like it was in the Middle Ages, especially in the late ones at that point, and during the feudal age. Because there has been a myth during the 14th century into which infantry had risen a little bit more, and eventually ransoming each other, very different from two Renaissance armies, stadal armies that clash against each other with a more unified command, with still mercenaries in their ranks, but really thrown into a hell of fire and smoke and pikes and all, and that is a bit more risky then. And there is all a literature about this. I mean, the idea of the old knight that kind of that fades into the face of firearms and all, which is also a bit of a myth, because knights were still out there, and they would remain so at least until the 17th century, at least in tactical terms. In social terms, they would survive practically until the beginning of the 20th century as a society. And relatively to this, there are people who also say the 30 Years' War was a bit different for cultural reasons, in the sense that the 30 Years' War being an extremely bloody conflict in many ways. 1/3 of the German population was wiped out by the war. There was the plague. There was a continuous and protracted warfare for 30 years, in fact, carried out by the major powers of Europe at the time: Spain, France, Austria, Sweden, and the German principalities. That really made a mess. And tactically speaking, the major engagements of the 30 Years' War were extremely bloody affairs. And there are certain people who say, well, why did this happen? Because the 17th century was the great age, especially in the first half during the 30 Years' War, of the religious passions. Like, people were so concerned about doctrinal affairs to even start a war or several wars on that base, the 30 Years' War being the major one, and being truly indoctrinated, even from a cultural point of view, either by the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic countries or by the Protestant preaching into the others, and therefore having this kind of ideal push that would bring them on the battlefield to be more likely to risk their lives for these religious beliefs. In my opinion, this is not really true. I mean, as a general picture of the period, it's definitely true in the sense that yes, the 17th century is definitely a moment of great spiritual tension, spiritual trouble. The 30 Years' War being kind of a religious war indeed, even if I'm very skeptic every time to call wars in the first place wars of one thing is to fight over something, another thing is fighting for something, and you can fight over religious matters but not really being really convinced by them. And even here we're still talking about the Ancien Regime in a kind of aristocratic Europe into which the middle classes existed as even historically speaking. There are many studies on diaries, on letters, even of common people who joined these fights, but like the major the first place in history being still occupied by the elites, by the aristocrats, then in this sense were the ones who were better educated, so that they could write more. They were probably even better, in this sense, better indoctrinated by the relative societies, in the sense that if you, I don't know, in Germany you were a Catholic prince, you would be quite heavily educated into that fashion on average, to be an extremely pious person and having always the Bible on your side. Think about even the English Civil War that was being fought at the same time, and how religious matters were important in the whole process, and even the lower classes participating to these beliefs. But if we look a bit closer, we must say that really the average soldier probably didn't care, just as in any other age of history of the great political or religious matters, and all they were there for, it's either because they were paid for it or because they were conscripted for it, so they were obliged. My understanding in this sense is that the very bloody affairs that took place in the 30 Years' War were mostly due also there to the really to the kind of warfare that existed at the time. I don't really want to stress the the idea that the 30 Years' War, for their tactics, for the tactics employed in it, was particularly bloodier than I don't know, 18th century tactics, or even in previous times. But indeed, I mean, the 30 Years' War was still extremely the 30 Years' War's battle being still, firearms not being enough powerful to break pikemen. They were still there, but being powerful enough to really make a very heavy rain of lead falling over them. So imagine these guys advancing on the field, being shot down. Because one thing is to shoot like in the 18th century, where you all get the same distance as musketeers and you start firing against each other. One thing is from the other side, you're a pikeman, so if you want to attack the enemy or arrive to the enemy, you have to physically go up to the enemy, either against other pikemen and engaging to these massive bloody pikemen's engagements, or being fired and shot down by musketeers, if not by artillery, and these pike formations, being quite excitingly hit and by artillery, because of all this thickly compact formation of people that could, in this sense, be torn apart by artillery projectiles, and also very messy engagements, because the smoke on the battlefield couldn't really make you understand what was going on, and especially firearms evolving in that time towards something more effective, and we know these were extremely bloody affairs. Even cavalry being once again more engaged from the previous century into action tactically, still risking a lot and being there also a lot of still of interchangeability between infantry and cavalry, in the sense that even the nobles and the that usually fought on horseback were used to have to have a military experience from the lower ranks, starting as pikemen. Yes, a lot of lords did that. That really shows you how still very flexible and demanding from an individual training point of view was that type of warfare. And you know, there are extremely bloody engagements, and think about Lutzen, think about there are by the way there is a beautiful literature about all this, about the 30 Years' War. If you have any chance to read, for instance, also Simplicius Simplicissimus, that is really something that makes you understand how Germany in the 30 Years' War really was about, and how life was extremely cheap in this sense. It's very famous, the letter of the last letter of Pappenheim, who wrote the last news from the battlefield with this letter that still is preserved with his own blood on it while he was dying. I mean, for really understanding how these guys who had all the reasons in the world to survive, in the sense that they were noblemen, etc., they were still very much used to fight independently from their religious points of view. I mean, the political and economical interests behind these battles were immense. Think about Wallenstein, who could become sort of king of Germany on his own, and how he was a mercenary. He was a businessman of war. He created an army from nothing, from his own even private resources, private assets, demonstrating that was a quite material interest, one of participating and being so eager to fight and to lead men, etc. So, as you probably understood, my opinion relatively to the prejudices of the mercenary, and we're talking about the 30 Years' War sees the major in the major employment of mercenaries in this sense. Just France and later Sweden were creating a sort of statal unitary force, but all the other participants, including Austria, were still using mercenaries in this sense. So, as you probably understood, my idea is that there are technicalities of war that cannot really be avoided. I mean, war really has a real and rules on its own. It's not something that you can disjunct from politics, because it is basically its own continuation through military affairs, through military with other means, through military means. But you know, in this sense, you can't really pretend that people die into war because you know, they are more or less prone to be willing that, because war is really anti. You know, it goes against every spirit of every hope of surviving. It's something artificial, very much. There is nothing it's very rational in its own kind. It's a decision that you would normally take more as a calculated risk than being more or less willing to fight. And the passions that move war, the reasons that move war, are important, but in this sense they're so strong that when you get on a battlefield, that's not really what matters at that point, because the battlefield will have laws on its own, and if you went all the way to go to the battlefield is, you're gonna go through it, and you will take the risks as they are. So it's not really something that you can decide in terms of, yeah, you can accept an engagement or not accept it, but that's also part of war. I mean, what's the point if this is what I didn't explain maybe about the Condottieri warfare, that even the same the same territory of the battlegrounds of this time were very heavily built up by military engineering. There would be a lot of field fortifications, already semi-permanent in certain cases, and those were all built for active military use. I mean, the idea that the war slows down and becomes a kind of a war position where there are no major engagements, no resolutive battles, is something that was, however, formed by the idea that you had to stop preventing the enemy from achieving some results. So at that point it was wall against wall, if you want, and the reason why these guys didn't really clash very often is that the battlefield was structured, and the political aims especially were structured in a fashion that they would rarely engage each other, relatively rarely. And when they did, however, bloodshed happened, and it really happened a lot. So you can't really say that there was no bloodshed in Condottieri warfare. This is the practical conclusion that I would like to leave you with. Maybe one day I will find I may make a video into which I will present with actual numerical data about this and prove actually what I'm saying. But for today I wanted just to make you reflect on the reality of war for what it is, aside from romanticism, aside from idealism, and really making you understand that when you fight a battle, you're there to kill, point, and that's what you're gonna do. So if it doesn't happen for some systemic factor, it's not really because you are a gentle soul or guided by ideals that prevent you from doing that, or you have a nature or a character that prevents you to do so. Most likely the battle is set into a strategical situation into which things maybe are meant not to evolve so quickly, and therefore that there would be a lot of abortions in this sense in the military operations. Or simply you want to force a block and you try it, you even lose people in the process, but you notice that you can't progress, so you would come back. And that's a matter of military technology of the Middle Ages. For most Middle Ages, pitched battles were very rare in this sense. So that didn't depend on the actual passions or the actual military willing of killing than the single person, or of the people who had sent those soldiers to perform that. If anything, it was a matter of lack of opportunities and of the rules of war from a material point of view that really obliged the armies to give up major engagements and really to make a lot of position warfare. I don't know how this video turned out really, because it was more or less my reflection without much data to add, but nevertheless I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or send or subscribe to my channel if you want to receive news about other contents of mine. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.